We'll move on to our last speaker, who is Dr. Calvin Booker, who received his Doctor of Veterinary Medicine in 1989 and his Master of Veterinary Science in 1992 from the Western College of Veterinary Medicine in Saskatchewan. He's a managing partner with Feedlot Health Management Services by TELUS Agriculture, with responsibilities that include managing the feedlot health production consulting business, directing research and development activities, and building the company growth and development plan. Feedlot Health provides comprehensive veterinary and production consulting services to feedlot and calf grower operations in multiple countries and has extensive research capabilities that focus on applied technologies. And with that, I'll pass it over to Calvin for his presentation.
Thanks, Aaron. I appreciate the opportunity to speak today and the introduction. Thanks very much. I'm just going to sort of pick up right where others have led into. Karen did a really nice job of summarizing the carbon market and where it's going, and Shati and Tim have both provided perspectives. I'm going to give you an example of what we've done on the feedlot side of trying to capture some of these carbon credits from feedlot production in Alberta. So just a couple of background perspective slides to provide some context. As Aaron said in the introduction, I mean, I'm a veterinarian, and you might be thinking, well, what's a veterinarian doing talking about greenhouse gas credits? I've been with Feedlot Health for almost 30 years now, and our company, while we started as a veterinary company, we're really involved in production consulting and research services for all aspects of what happens in commercial feedlots and calf grower operations. Next slide, please. I mean, we're based in Okotoks, but we provide our services in a variety of different countries: Canada, United States, Mexico, Brazil, Kazakhstan, and others. And while we started in Western Canada, our biggest customer base is in the United States. And the annual throughput of our client operations is about 4 million beef cattle a year. Next slide, please. And we get to work with feedlot producers in a variety of geographic areas, which obviously have a whole bunch of different climatic conditions under which they produce. Some of these feedlots are actually confinement facilities with solid floors, roofs, and that kind of stuff. Obviously, the ones in Western Canada are open air, and we kind of got everything in between. We produce involved in systems that have winter like we would have in Western Canada, whether that's in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, or in Alberta. But we'd also have some stuff in some very tropical areas of the world as well. Next slide. And the last slide for perspective and background is that we're a big company, we have a big team, and it's not just a couple of us as veterinarians or PhD animal scientists that are trying to work our way through these types of production issues for feedlots, including looking at greenhouse gas emissions and carbon credits. And it takes a whole team to make that work. So that little bit as providing context and perspective. Let's go to the next slide. And we talk a little bit about beef greenhouse gas emissions. Many of the people on this call are probably very familiar with this, but if we look at greenhouse gas emissions from beef production and we look at it globally, there's a lot of difference in the intensity of emissions based on the efficiency of production. And if we look at this map, the areas where there's the dark green color is where the greenhouse gas emissions from beef production per unit of production are pretty low. And then there's other areas where the greenhouse gas emissions per unit of beef production are very high. And that tends to relate to sort of 2 or 3 factors. One, it relates to age at the time of harvest. And in areas where animals are older when there's harvested, generally speaking, there are more greenhouse gas emissions prior to in the production process. It also relates to the types of feedstuffs and forages and the amount of technology that we use in the production system. So if you look in Europe and if you look in North America, the greenhouse gas emissions generally per unit of production are much lower than they are in some other areas of the world. Next slide. if we look at the carbon footprint in the U.S. and the Canadian one is very similar. The agriculture accounts, and it depends a little bit on exactly how you do all the accounting, but somewhere is between 8 and 10% of total emissions in the United States, and it's very similar in Canada. And then if you actually look at of that, only a portion of that is related to beef cattle. And so if you look at the total greenhouse gas emissions, beef cattle represents somewheres around 2% of the total country's greenhouse gas emissions. And again, this is the US, Canada is quite similar. Next slide. And there's been several studies that have looked at the life cycle analyses on the beef cattle system and what those emissions are. You can see those listed there. Some of those are from the US, some of those are actually from Canada. They all more or less show about the same thing. And if we average those, and remember, it's only 2% of emissions, but of that 2%, now we're carving it up into a pie to see where it is. Roughly 70 to 75% comes from the cow-calf sector. 14 or 15% comes from the stalker, grower, backgrounder sector, and 14 or 15% comes from the feedlot sector. Next slide. So then if we start thinking about what can be affected and then maybe more importantly from an emissions side of things, what might we be able to quantify? If we look at the feedlot side to start with, and we sort of compare the feedlot and the cow-calf side, in the feedlot side, I think emissions can be readily quantified or calculated. We've got really good production records. We know what the feedstuffs are, et cetera. If we were going to make reductions, we can probably readily quantify those or calculate those as well. The diet methane formation potential in our feedlot diets is pretty low because of the types of diets that we feed them, grain-based diets. If we were thinking down the road and thinking about incorporating things into the system that might mitigate methane production, should be very straightforward to do. And doing some of these things, it's really possible to actually show cost effectiveness of incorporating some of these technologies. And so uptake of those technologies may not require regulation or other things to stimulate it to happen. If we compare that to the cow-calf side of things, the emissions are hard to quantify or calculate because it's very difficult to know exactly what consumption is. And there's a variety of different diets that cows are eating in during the cow-calf side of things. And the diet methane potential formation is likely very high, but it's also very variable. So a little much harder to do than in a feedlot type situation where we know exactly what the feedstuffs are and the intakes are. If we were thinking about trying to incorporate some sort of methane mitigation or mitigants, it'd be much more difficult to do, not impossible, but certainly more challenging. And cost effectiveness of many of these things would be difficult to measure or assess. And so there may need other drivers that could drive adoption of some of these things, and that could include things like regulation as one of those. Next slide. So the other question is relative to emissions in our systems, our beef cattle production systems in North America, are we already at really low levels? And the answer is we are already at pretty low levels. If we look at those methane emission factors as a percent of gross energy intake, you can see that finishing cattle, we're kind of in the 3 to 4% range, and it's a little bit higher on grazing cattle, which would include the cow-calf side of things. And part of that is because we've already adopted things in our production system that reduce that methane emission. We already talked about high concentrate diets as opposed to high forage diets. Things like ionophore use, maybe adding fat to the diet, ad lib intake, and some of our other management things that we do. So we've already made big steps, but there's probably some additional ones we could do. So there's some background. If we go to the next slide, let's talk about trying to capture carbon credits from Alberta feedlots. So Our discussions really started all the way back in 2009 with Trimble, which was Agritrends at the time, and I think many people on the call would know who they are. An aggregation firm in the carbon credit world. And they said, gee, with all the different technologies that you guys adopt over time in the feedlot sector, there must be some ways that we could show that we're calculating to have lower emissions. And I said, well, I guess we need to review the existing fed cattle protocol that was in place in Alberta. Karen alluded to that being put in place in 2007 in Alberta. So we took quite a while to study that and understand what the components and the methodologies were. And it became apparent as we went through that there were some things in the first version of that fed cattle protocol that would make it very difficult for most feedlots to comply, because a lot of it was built on cattle spending less time in feedlots, which actually cattle were actually spending possibly more time in feedlots, not less. And so we really wanted to change the discussion to have it focus on feed efficiency and look at the emissions that were happening relative to the feed efficiency side of things. The second thing was, as we worked through that, then we realized we needed to develop an appropriate methodology to try and quantify what these greenhouse gas emissions were, and to tell if we were making progress over time compared to some baseline. That wasn't easy. I think a lot of people think of feedlots as pretty uniform type operations, where you've got the same size animals, same sex animals coming in the feedlot on one end and going out on some regular basis out the other end, and the production system's all the same. But it's actually quite a bit more complex than that. So to actually tell if you're making progress or not, you really have to be comparing apples to apples within the production system. So we had to do a lot of things on the data side to do that. Obviously, once we had come up with a methodology, then we had to have that sort of vetted and reviewed and verified with Alberta government scientists to see that they agreed with our thought processes of how that would work. And then finally, that led to update and approval of the official quantification protocol listed there, version 3.0, February 2016, which allowed us to sort of move forward. Next slide. And the way we went about this is we actually worked with two of our client feedlot operations that operated 4 different sites. They had excellent production records, which are key to trying to do the quantification and assessment of whether we were making changes. They had really good lot closeouts. We needed carcass data. We needed accurate commodity usage numbers. We had to have animal IDs, so that unique animal IDs, so that we could make sure that some robustness in the system to make sure we weren't double claiming carbon credits, et cetera. And essentially we had to establish a 3-year baseline for each site, and then compare subsequent years to that baseline and calculate the emissions and see if we were making progress. Next slide. So all of that, we started in 2009. We didn't actually get around to being able to harvest and sell the first greenhouse gas credits from the pilot feedlots till 2016, because it took that long for all of those different steps to happen. I guess the good news was, because we'd started this and registered the project in 2012, we were able to claim offsets in that first year for production years 2012 through 2015. And then, of course, once you've done that, then you've got to go through the regular things in a regulated market of working through the appropriate steps, which includes quantification, verification, registration, serialization, and sale, which is fine. And obviously, Trimble was able to work through those things because that's their business. We've continued to be able to harvest greenhouse gas credits from those pilot projects feedlots over time, so in the subsequent project years. And the initial term of that plan was 8 years, and we can apply for an additional 5-year extension, and so we're just applying for that now. Next slide. Since 2016, we've registered a couple of new offset project plans to qualify additional client feedlots. And that process involves us getting the appropriate records from those sites, compiling them and quantifying what the emissions look like, and then assessing whether the project years versus, again, a 3-year baseline, whether there's anything to claim there or not in the case where we've lowered emissions. To give you an idea of where we're at, and I see there's a typo on this slide, but through production year 2019, we have harvested 113,000 tons, not megatons. If we had that many megatons, we'd be doing really good, but tons of CO2 equivalents from 9 different feedlot sites in the province of Alberta. And our initial credits, that offsets that we claimed from the pilot feedlots, we actually went through an official government audit of the initial plan, and we passed that in 2020 with only a couple of pretty minor improvements that we needed to make. Next slide. So what have we learned in this process? Some take-home messages, certainly from our experience. So I guess the first one was, it was not a quick or easy process to develop the methodology and figure out how to work through the Alberta Fed Cattle Protocol. That just took time to sort of to work our way through things and for things to evolve. The second, I think, big take-home message is it really required cooperation between sort of 3 separate but necessary partners in that. First of all, it was the feedlot producers themselves that had the records and the data. Secondly, it took quite a bit of expertise from our team to be able to compile and analyze the data, put it together in a way that we could actually compare apples to apples and figure out if we were actually making progress over time. And then 3, you obviously need to work with an aggregator that knows the carbon credit transaction system and all of the things that go around that. So it was a really good example of a partnership between sort of three independent parties coming together to do something that no one or no 2 of them could accomplish otherwise. And 3, it's allowed for the capture of emission reductions over time, and it looks, as we continue to make improvements and lower emissions in feedlots, that we'll be able to use this same type of system going forward. And with that, I think I'll stop there, turn it back over to you, Aaron, and we can go from there.